So Lucasfilm has been sued for its recreation of Peter Cushing as Grand Moff Tarkin in the 2016 film Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. Cushing's friend Kevin Francis is claiming that he and Cushing made an agreement back in the 90s, like right before Cushing died, that Francis would have the right to approve or reject any recreation of Cushing's image. So what's the context for this? So Peter Cushing played Grand Moff Tarkin all the way back in 1977 in the original Star Wars film. And when they were making the prequel film, not the prequels, capital P, but the prequel film Rogue One, which takes place it's a prequel film set right before the original Star Wars film, and it's all about the rebels getting the Death Star plans. That are the big focus of the original Star Wars, right? So setting it there, they decided they wanted to include Grand Moff Tarkin as a character. But obviously, Peter Cushing has been dead for, at that point, over 20 years, right? So what they did was they used hyper-realistic digital technology to essentially recreate Cushing for the film. Another actor provided the voice and motion capture for the character. And this allowed, especially for the time, was a huge technological breakthrough. And it was something that wasn't in the trailer, so I remember being in the theater and it being kind of like a big surprise in the movie to see this, right? So Lucasfilm feels like it had every right to do this, that this lawsuit is frivolous, right? Because, in their argument, Cushing had signed the original contract for the original film, which, of course, allowed for his likeness to be recreated, like for toys, for example, or on posters and stuff, right? But the legal question, which, of course, was not even conceivable back in 1970, in the mid-70s, should these rights to likeness extend to a scenario where you're able to essentially recreate and by extension replace the actor, right? Because of course he's dead, but this could be a really big slippery slope of where you could just replace actors that are still living. You just don't want to use them because they're maybe too expensive, right? And they said they did pay about $37,000 to Cushing's estate, which did approve it. But this friend Kevin Francis is asserting that they did not have the right to approve it. I was the one who has the right to approve it. So Lucasfilm has tried, I think, twice to get this dismissed. And the Deputy High Court Judge Tom Mitchison dismissed Lucasfilm's appeal against the lawsuit, saying, quote, I am not persuaded that the case is I am also not persuaded that the case is unarguable to the standard required to give summary judgment or to strike it out. In an area of developing law, it is very difficult to decide where the boundaries might lie in the absence of a full factual inquiry, end quote. So their argument is basically, this is so new that we can't just dismiss it out of hand. We should let this work through the legal system so we can create some precedent, have some legal minds kind of review this and see kind of where the pieces fall. And again, this revisits a question that had always been talked about, but this situation, Peter Cushing being recreated for Rogue One, this whole lawsuit revisits the question that was first raised by that recreation almost a decade ago, right? Should we've determined we can. Should we be recreating actors' likenesses, right? Even if their estate agrees to it, there's no guarantee that the person would have agreed to, right? This has been, this technology has been used for ads. So I remember, I think the big one before this was back in 2014. Galaxy Chocolate did an ad that created like a digital replica of a young Audrey Hepburn, who of course had passed away long before. I remember that was a really big deal. What does it say about culture that we keep these characters and actors alive digitally in perpetuity forever, right? It feels very regressive and a very mediocre feedback loop where we're just so focused on these. Because again, everything that we are trying to preserve, the corporations try to preserve in perpetuity, were once new novel things. So eventually, if you just focus on that stuff, eventually you'll run out of stuff to continue, right? And Star Wars has been very guilty of this many times over this decade since then, right? So in the same film, we also got very briefly, spoiler alert, at the very end, we got a digital recreation of a young Carrie Fisher as Princess Leia. Of course, she was still alive at the time, so she signed off on it, but again, still kind of creepy. Of course, older Carrie Fisher, they had to kind of do some digital recreation for her inclusion in Episode 9, because of course she had passed away before they began production on that film. A young Mark Hamill was recreated for use on The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett Disney Plus shows. And now we're seeing, AI adding to this, using AI voice cloning. So, for example, James Earl Jones had been the Vader voice for a bunch of stuff, even recently. So Darth Vader is also in Rogue One briefly, and you can tell that he's now being voiced by a much older man, but it's James Earl Jones, right? He went to the recording studio and did it. He has now since passed away, but for the Obi-Wan show, I remember noticing that the voice was way more lively. It felt more like the old days, and I was like, wow, did they give James Earl Jones like amphetamines or something? Like, why is he? It turns out it was AI voice cloning. That James Earl Jones signed off on his voice rights for Darth Vader, and they were able to recreate the voice using AI and voice cloning, right? And not to mention characters like R2-D2 or Chewbacca, who, because they're not identifiable human beings, those are going to continue forever. And that speaks to an IGN article that was written by Scott Kalora saying, quote, it was titled, quote, "The Sad Fate of the Star Wars Characters Disney Will Never Let Die," end quote. So it also creates like narrative problems where you have these characters that you as a corporation will just never let die. Or at least stop using them. Like, let them have their happy ending, let them go off into the sunset. So we're just obsessed. Star Wars has this big problem of being obsessed with its legacy and its legacy characters. And again, this was a really interesting philosophical question back in 2016, but it's even more relevant now, right? So it speaks to the questions we're currently facing. A big part of the actors' strike last year had to do with AI protections, right? So there have been stories of extras and even major actors potentially being scanned and paid out for their likeness to be used at the studio's discretion. So, you might show up as an extra, they scan you, you do one day of shooting, and then they use your likeness in background for scenes as much as they want, and you basically can't do anything about it, right? So the fact this lawsuit is being brought is kind of weird that it's taken this long, but it is even more relevant than it was back in 2016.